Well, welcome everybody to the briefing room. And with me today is our guest, Professor Omer Bartov. And we are going to be talking about his book, The Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, and the barbarization of warfare. Now, this is your seminal work. It's a brilliant piece of analysis, and it made me see war in a totally different way. Um, my first question is why? Why this particular subject?
Well, I mean, I must say it's interesting that you're asking me about this book. This book is quite old.
Mm,
This book is based on my PhD dissertation, as you can guess. Look at me, I wrote it a long time ago. Uh, so it's based on a dissertation that I wrote at Oxford in 1983, and it came out in 1985, the book
mm,
itself. Then it was reissued, um, I think in the early 2000s, with a new introduction.
mhm,
Um, so the question that I asked there, and then in a subsequent book called Hitler's Army, that also came out a long time ago in 1991, uh, was a question that has kept interesting me to this day. And I more recently wrote about it in a very different context, in the context of the war in Gaza. And that's what makes soldiers do what they do. How do they understand what they're doing? How are they motivated to act as they do in one place differently from another? And most especially, why do soldiers at times become involved in war crimes?
mm,
And in the case of the Eastern Front, what I call the barbarization of warfare in massive war crimes. One has to remember that in the war on the Eastern Front, about 26 to 27 million Soviet citizens, about a third of them soldiers, the rest civilians, were killed. And that was obviously clearly connected not only to the crimes of the Gestapo, the SS, but also of the German armed forces. So this was the question that interested me at the time. At the time, it was very uncommon to think of the German army as having been engaged in war crimes. We tend to forget that. The convention was that the German army fought a decent war, and that was the memory in Britain,
mm,
in the United States, among those who fought the Germans on the Western Front or in Italy or in North Africa. And that the crimes that occurred happened, as the Germans said, behind the back of the fighting troops. They were carried out by other people, but not the German military. And I was part of a small group of historians, the others at the time were German, I'm not German, who stopped believing this myth of the purity of arms of the Wehrmacht and started looking into what actually went on the Eastern Front. And my approach to that, because this was a huge war, there were hundreds of divisions fighting, German divisions fighting on the Eastern Front. The scale was completely different from what we saw even at the height of the war in the West, after June 1944. Even then, the size of the German armed forces was vastly bigger on the Eastern Front. So my approach to that was to take three divisions, which were in some ways represented different aspects of the fighting troops, and to look very closely at what they were engaged in, where they recruited their soldiers, especially the junior officers, how they were educated, and then what actually happened there. And the book was based largely on that material.
well, it's very in depth, very detailed, and fascinating. Before Operation Barbarossa, how did the Germans think that the war in the East was going to go?
Well, if you want to understand Operation Barbarossa, then you have to go back to the German attack in the West.
Mm,
At the time, when the Germans were planning to attack the French and the British in the West, they had an operational plan for that. The original plan, curiously, was captured by the Allies. Some airplane had an emergency landing. The intelligence officer on that plane had the operational plans, and the Germans realized, well, the Allies probably have the war plans, and they changed them. And they were very lucky to have done that because the original plan was very similar to the Schlieffen Plan, which was the one for 1914 when the German army attacked in 1914. That is to try and reach the English Channel and then march down the English Channel toward Paris.
Mm-hmm.
That was changed because it was captured. It was not a particularly imaginary plan. And a new plan was put into operation, which was to send the greatest concentration of German armor at the time. So this is World War II, and the Germans already have armored divisions through the Ardennes forest to reach the English Channel behind the forces, the Allied forces, the British and the French and whatever there was of Belgian forces behind them, and to cut them off from their supplies. That was a brilliant plan. It was very risky, of
Yeah.
course, because these armored units were running away from their own supply lines and could have themselves been cut off. And actually, General de Gaulle at the time, who was a commander of an armored division, tried to do that, but the French didn't have enough armor to do that. That plan succeeded brilliantly, and as a result of that, the Germans won the campaign in the West in 6 weeks. And you have to remember that in World War One, for the Germans, this was a deeply traumatizing war. They fought
Yeah.
it for 4 years, lost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men. And so that came to be called Blitzkrieg, a lightning war, where you punch in at some point of the front with a concentration of armor and airplanes, especially tactical support airplanes, dive bombers, and so forth. You punch a hole in the front, and you usually then cut off the sharp end of the enemy's forces
Mm-hmm.
from its supplies, and thereby you basically strangulate them. That's what they did in the West, and as a result of that, German generals that were quite skeptical about whether they could defeat the French and the British became, quite confident that they could do that definitely against the Red Army that they didn't think much of, and against a system that they believed was, in any case, quite weak, because as you may recall, in the 1930s, Stalin is engaged in a major purge, and the Great Purge, part of that is to basically decapitate the Red Army. He murders many of his own generals. And so the Germans plan Operation Barbarossa as a sort of larger version of what they did on the Western Front. And that's a huge mistake on their part.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what is so interesting is that the Germans actually, the German Reichswehr, that is the army of the Weimar Republic, had invented in the late 1920s a thing called war game, which now all armies practice. And a war game is basically you play both sides. You don't do it with soldiers, you do it on maps, but you try to imagine what would happen if you do certain things. And if you do it well, and within the rules of it, then you can find out what may happen. And the Germans did that before Operation Barbarossa. And surprise, surprise, they discovered that the deeper they move into the Soviet Union, the wider the front is. The front expanded by about 1,000 kilometers as they moved in because of the shape, the geographical shape. And that they did not have enough forces to be able to cover all the territory, and that the armored units would run away from the infantry that they needed to cover them, and from the supply routes. And so when they eventually attacked on the 22nd of June 1941, initially they won massive victories and captured huge numbers of Red Army soldiers. But because the Red Army was large and because Stalin refused to capitulate, they eventually found themselves unable to accomplish their goals. I would say that the war in the East, that it was decided that Germany would not win that war by early to late December 1941. And everything that happened after that could not lead to a German victory.
And can you talk a little bit about how material conditions affected the soldiers' psyche, the weather and the conditions, etc.?
Right. So, in the Eastern Front, in that book, and then also in Hitler's Army, the book that came out a few years later, where I talk in a bit more detail about this issue, I try to see the relationship between the material conditions in which the soldiers fought and what they had internalized, the sort of image of the enemy they had internalized even before they went to the war, and how there was a play one against the other. So the German army, as about 3 million soldiers, as they march into the Soviet Union, have to cover vast tracts of land, and many of them, of course, walking into the Soviet Union, about 30 kilometers every day, over weeks and weeks and weeks. And initially, it's quite hot, of course. You're talking about late June, July, August, but the fighting is very hard from the very beginning. The German army is taking much greater losses than on any other front before that, in any other previous campaign. And then weather conditions do what they do in Russia. So you have a rain and mud period, the Schlammperiode, as the Germans called it, the Rasputitsa. That's what the Russians call it, where especially in the central part of the front, the roads, which are mostly dirt roads, turn into rivers of mud. And it's almost impossible to move any tracked vehicles. And the Germans use, one tends to forget, they had many tanks. They had about 3,000 tanks, but they had about 600,000 horses, which were pulling wagons, just like in previous wars. There was not enough, the kind of image of, armies with many lorries. That's later on, and it's more the Red Army being supplied with American lorries later on in the war. But the Germans used these very old-style wagons once they run away from railheads. And they just get bogged down, and they can't move, or they move very slowly. And that's, of course, playing in favor of the defender of the Red Army, which is constantly retreating. Shortly thereafter, as Hitler, after having first ordered the German army to capture Kiev in the south and moving many of his troops from the center to the south to capture Kiev, then redirects these forces to the center and sends them in Operation Typhoon to try and capture Moscow. And at that point, as they start moving on in October, it starts snowing and the temperatures begin dropping. This was a very, very cold winter. It was an exceptionally cold winter. Temperatures dropped to as low as minus 40 Celsius.
Wow.
Very, very cold. It was so cold that they had to keep fires under the tanks because they couldn't start them. The oil would freeze. And having fire under a tank filled with ammunition is not the greatest thing you want to do. So when that happens, all this mud that turns into snow and ice, conditions become very, very difficult. So one thing that we can say is that of the estimated million German soldiers who become casualties, either killed or wounded by late December 1941, following a Soviet counteroffensive in early December that pushes the Germans away from Moscow, many of those, the vast majority of the wounded, are not wounded by enemy bullets, but injured by the cold, suffering very severe frostbite. Now, obviously, everybody at the time had an association of what happened to Napoleon's Grande Armée, which was exactly the same. But Hitler refused to pay attention to that, as he refused to pay attention to the war game that predicted much of what actually happened. He said, well, okay, that's a war game, but we are the German army. Look how we lick the French and the British, much better armies, Westerners. Now, all of this, as I said before, is connected to a particular image of the Red Army and a particular image of Russians. And the Germans, when they go to fight in the Soviet Union, they are fighting not just the Russians, who they think are sort of primitive, and Asiatics, as they call them. And there was very deeply embedded racism. But also they're fighting what they call Judeo-Bolshevism. And for them, the leadership of the Soviet Union are Jews, and these Jews are using the masses of primitive Slavs to try and destroy civilization. That's how it is perceived. And the soldiers, when they move in, even in the early part, they write home all these letters where they're saying, we have now seen what the Soviet paradise, what the Soviet paradise looks like. People live in hovels. They don't even have paved floors. They live like animals. And all this kind of combination of general prejudice about the East and about Russians and about Jews, combined with Nazi indoctrination that these soldiers internalized, first of all, as young boys in school. These are people who went to school already in the Third Reich. They go to war in 41, Hitler comes to power in 33, so it's exactly the years in which these young men go to school. They go to the Hitler Youth, they listen to the radio, they go to movies, and then when they come to the army indoctrinates them much more deeply. These are materials that I spent a lot of time reading, not the most pleasant kind of reading. And so their encounter with a combination of really harsh conditions, of very tough resistance, and of an image of the enemy that is demonic, dehumanizing, lead also to I'd say, an accelerating brutalization of the soldiers and their treatment of not only enemy soldiers, but also of civilians.
Did the Jewish Bolshevik actually exist, or was it all in the Germans' mind?
No, and of course not. It's a propaganda thing. Stalin in the 1930s. So I mean, if you go back historically, most of the Jews of Europe before World War II lived in Eastern Europe and Western Russia. In fact, most of the Jews of the world lived there. About 80% of all Jews in the world lived there at the time. And there was growing anti-Semitism in the years leading to the Russian Revolution, and then in the new states that were created after World War I. And there are growing limits on where Jews can go to, because we have the Great Depression, we have unemployment, other countries don't want to take refugees, not unlike what we are seeing today. Yeah. Many young Jews believe that socialism will actually liberate them from the scourges of what they themselves are experiencing, that is racism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, because socialism promises to do away with all of that. Religion is the opium of the masses, right? And we will have just a new world that will be made of workers who will rule over themselves. And so by the 1930s, Jews are quite heavily represented within socialism, including in the Soviet Union. There's a higher representation than their actual percentage in the population. Not as high as the Latvians. The most highly represented, for strange reasons, are the Latvians, which are not a very large people. But Stalin becomes worried about anti-Semitism within the Soviet Union. And so he actually purges the ranks of the Bolshevik Party of Jews so as to not have too high a representation of Jews. Now, of course, these people are not a majority of the Jews. They are themselves a minority, but they're more visible. The Nazis make hay out of this because of their own anti-Semitic ideology, and they present, there's a very famous poster and propaganda post by the German army about the Bolshevik, the Commissar. What does the Commissar look like? And they describe the Commissar as looking like a Jew. And that's the clear sort of connection between the two. And there is the German army, when he marches into the Soviet Union, is given a Kommissar order, the Kommissarbefehl. And the Kommissar order says that if you identify a Kommissar, and how do you identify them? They have a cap with a red star on top. You take them aside and you shoot them. There's no summarily shoot them. And they kill about 600,000 commissars, obviously the majority
Jesus.
of whom are not Jews. And so in that sense, it's a combination within the Nazi imaginary of several elements of derision for the Slav masses, of very deep anti-Semitism, and of course of the goal of Germany to create for itself what they called a Lebensraum, a living space. And what would be the living space? It would be Eastern Europe and Western Russia. And we want the land, but we don't want the people in it. So these people have to go.
Yeah.
First kill the Jews and then either enslave the Slavs. The word, of course, actually comes from the Roman word for slave, or let them die in vast numbers. As Hermann Goering said, they can die by the tens of millions as far as we're concerned.
At what point did the discipline give way to the brutality?
So yeah, that's in Hitler's army, I actually dedicate in that book, I dedicate a whole chapter to this question of discipline, because on the one hand, the German army was known for its very harsh discipline, and discipline was much harsher in World War II in the German army than in World War One, if you count that by executions. So large numbers of people were executed for all kind of disciplinary offenses, especially if those were perceived as having an ideological aspect to them. So if you deserted the front, you were not just tried for cowardice or for desertion or abandoning your comrades. It was supposed to be an ideological treason. And so you were actually quite likely to be executed, and your family would also be deprived of any pension that you might have received otherwise had you been killed. And that, by the way, continued in West Germany, with former SS members receiving pensions from the German Federal Republic, and families of those who were executed ideologically by the Wehrmacht not receiving pensions for decades. This was only handled in the 1990s, I believe. So that's a kind of aftermath of this. So on the one hand, there was very strict discipline. On the other hand, there was growing indiscipline in terms of conduct vis-a-vis the civilian population. And this in large part was built into the kind of orders that soldiers were given in the Barbarossa decree itself, so that military jurisdiction was waived as far as the treatment of Slavs, Jews, and partisans was concerned, as long as it didn't impinge on military discipline. That is, or on ideological grounds. So if, for instance, in France, a German soldier broke into a house, committed armed robbery and rape, it was very likely that this individual would be heavily punished, and quite a number of them were executed for such crimes. If you did the same in Russia, at the most you might be disciplined for having had sex with a Slav woman. So because you're not supposed to. Of course, a lot of this was happening and nobody really paid attention. So in that sense, it's not simply indiscipline. It's a brutalization of troops, which is happening within a military framework that facilitates that but sets limits to it. Uh, the army marching into the Soviet Union, knowing that they would have severe logistical issues, brought very little food with them. They brought munitions with them, but very little food because you have to carry all this stuff with you. And instead, they told soldiers to live off the land, just like marauding armies in the 30 Years' War. And if you go to a place like Belarus, one of the poorest places in Europe at the time, not very wealthy even now, they would take the peasants' food from them. They would take their cows, their pigs, stored grains, and just use it all up.
Mm.
And so as a result of that, much of the death that is happening in those areas among the civilian population is hunger. One historian, Christian Gerlach, who wrote about this, calls this Hungerpolitik. It's hunger politics. And part of it is we actually don't care that they die. It's good for us because, after all, we want the land for ourselves. And so it combines this indiscipline and very harsh punishment for what the regime sees as ideological crimes or of refusal to continue the fighting.
And see, when you were saying about them being shot for desertion, they're just kids, and they go into something that brutal. It's just amazing to me that anybody actually went ahead and fought. I mean, everybody must be scared out of their wits.
So it is a very interesting question. I was asking myself after July 20th, 1944, when there was an attempted assassination of Hitler, it was clear that the front was collapsing. The Red Army was moving more and more rapidly to the west.
Mm.
And of course, now the Allies, the Americans and the Brits and the French and the Canadians, are moving from the west. What is interesting is that the resistance being put up by German soldiers on the east is much greater than on the west. So part of the higher losses of the German army in the east are because they are fighting much more fiercely than in the west,
Mm.
which partly explains the rapid advance in the west. Why are they doing that? Well, what German soldiers internalized from the very beginning was something else. It's this is our deadly enemy. These are the people who betrayed Germany already in 1918, in November 1918, when the German army collapsed in the West. Why did it collapse? I mean, we were fighting, we were very strong because we were stabbed in the back. This was the Durchstoß Legende, the stab in the back legend. Who stabbed us in the back? The Bolsheviks and the Jews. Now, when we go to fight in the Soviet Union, we have to make sure that it never happens again. So we have to make sure that all those people who might stab us in the back are killed long before they can do that. But if we do all those things to them, we can imagine what they will do to us if we lose. And we know what we did to them. German soldiers fighting in 44 had pretty good knowledge of the incredible devastation that they wreaked in the Soviet Union. And now they are fighting to defend their homeland from those Asiatic Judeo-Bolshevik hordes that in their imagination will do the same to them. So when you have units that decide, okay, this is too much for us, they don't surrender to the Red Army. They try to run over to the other side and to surrender to the Americans and the Brits because rightly they believe that they will get much better treatment there as prisoners of war rather than be at best sent to gulags by Stalin's regime. So that kind of fighting has to do not only with discipline, it has to do with an image of what the enemy can do to you and why you have to keep holding out until the last moment.
And in your research, what sources reveal how the soldiers justify their violence?
So, what I used in my dissertation and later on when I was writing my second book, there were, I'd say, to gauge how the soldiers were viewing the reality, this sort of, as I called it, a kind of distorted image of reality. The main sources were, there were a few diaries, there were many letters, there were also, interestingly, many intelligence reports by the censorship department that would go through letters, and in the reports it would cite from soldiers' letters.
Mm.
And so I worked with hundreds of letters and diaries that provided a pretty powerful indication of how the soldiers perceive their own reality. Since I did that work, again, this is a long time ago,
Mhm.
uh, there were other scholars who've used the same or other collections of letters. But my impression is that sort of picture that I reconstructed at the time has not changed, that these other collections are more or less consistent.
Mhm.
There is always a question, and that's something that American sociologists were writing about already in the 1940s, but it's still a kind of question that has remained. What makes soldiers fight? And there's one tendency to say that soldiers, first of all, fight for their buddies. I mean, they are in a unit and you are close to your comrades. First of all, your friends, and you've been sort of linked together through suffering and blood, and also for your own perseverance, because if you betray them, they'll betray you. So there is a kind of unity in blood and solidarity, and of course that's true. There's no denying that. But I've argued, and that's also based on my own experience as a soldier in '73 in the Israeli army, that that's not uh, the only thing, and I would say it's not the overriding thing. Certainly not in conscription armies. If you're a professional army, it may be a bit different, but in a conscription army where you're just taken as a civilian and turned into a soldier temporarily, why is this happening? It's happening because of some national call, right? The nation calls you to arms. So in that sense, that people actually feel that the solidarity is not only one of their closeness to their comrades, but that they're fighting for a higher cause. And
Mm.
as long as you can persuade them that they're doing that, that they are saving something much more abstract, their nation, their race, their religion, whatever it might be, that is an extremely powerful motivating factor. In Germany, when you think about the very strong allegiance that there was and remained to Hitler himself, it's an allegiance. So there was a kind of sense of saving Germany, making Germany great again, and all of that. And then also a sort of love to the Führer. It wasn't fear. Of course, there was fear, but there was also love. And that lingered on even after the defeat. It, of course, went underground because you couldn't talk about it. But it lingered for a long time thereafter, the sense of mourning for the loss of all that, a sense of betrayal by young Germans that the Führer had committed suicide on them and had betrayed them. So these are very strong elements especially when you talk about young men who feel so strongly tied to a mission and cannot believe that they dedicated their lives and their health to the wrong thing, that they were actually engaged in war crimes. And it took, I mean, my first two books came out in '85 and '91. In 1999, there was still a major debate in Germany over the Wehrmacht exhibition. There was a roaming exhibition in Germany between 1995 and 1999, which was seen by a million Germans and Austrians which show documents and photographs of crimes of the German army for the first time.
Mm.
And it caused a huge debate in Germany, enormous controversy, and it was actually closed down in 1999 because there were like 8 out of 1,400 photographs that had been mislabeled, and people pounced on that and said, well, it's not reliable. Uh, so this sense of allegiance to the army, to the just war, remained for another 40 years.
Why do you think that was? Do you think it's the Germans not wanting to see themselves in a bad light, or why did it persist for so long?
I think, look, I mean, I came to Germany for the first time in 1979 as a young man to do research, to learn German and do research. And at the time, the Germans still hadn't gotten their head around the fact that they carried out the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1980s, there was a big change. And Germany, which had already, of course, paid restitution to Israel in the early 50s, but that was more of a political act. But in terms of German second generation German mentality, things changed in the 1980s and 90s, and there was a general acceptance that Germany was responsible and guilty of the Holocaust, of the genocide of the Jews. The line was usually about the crimes committed in the name of the German army,
Mm.
of the German people. So not by the German people, but in the name of the German people. So who committed those crimes? Well, when you talked about the Holocaust, you talked about the SS, about the Gestapo. Now, obviously, there were Germans who had relatives who served in the SS or the Gestapo, but most Germans, if they thought about their fathers and uncles and brothers, they were in the German army. The German army was huge. There were 20 million people who went through the ranks.
Mm.
And so you could say, yes, of course, crimes were committed in our name by all these black and brown shirts. But our fathers, they fought, they were victims of the war. Hitler sent them to fight and die in Stalingrad. That's what Germans said. There was
Mm.
a whole industry of films in Germany, the 1950s, going into the 90s actually, about, good German boys, handsome, well educated, play the piano, and they go off to fight in Stalingrad in a lost war, and they are the victims. And so to turn that around and to say that to the public, as one German member of parliament in the 1990s was standing in parliament responding to that exhibition and crying and saying, I cannot believe that my father was a war criminal. He fought in the East. He came back a wreck, which was, of course, true. I
Mm.
mean,
Yeah.
but they were those who did it, and so that's something that's very different. It's not only in Germany. Uh, if you think in the United States, there is a Vietnam memorial. It's a very moving memorial. I don't know if you saw it in
Yeah.
Washington,
Yeah.
D.C., right?
I've been to it. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But
Heavy.
who is commemorated there? 60,000 Americans.
Mm.
What were they doing in Vietnam?
Mm.
How many hundreds of thousands of people did they kill? There is no memorial for the victims, the actual victims of the war of Vietnam, who were the Vietnamese
Mm.
in America. And so the Germans actually succeeded after a 20-year long debate to create a monument for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust in one of the best pieces of real estate in Europe, right? Right next to the Brandenburg Tor in Berlin, there's this
Mm.
vast memorial. And that's extremely rare that a country commemorates not its own victims, but those it's victimized,
Mm.
right? But in terms of the army, which was representative of the nation, that even today is quite hard for people to take. And I'll say, one other strange thing about it is that nowadays there's a bit of a backlash against all kinds of things that I and other historians were writing in the 80s and 90s. And I find that quite curious because World War II in Europe was decided by the Red Army. It wasn't decided by the British Army or the US
Yeah.
Army or the French or the Canadians or the Australians, the New Zealanders. I mean, they all fought and they sacrificed, but the back of the German army was broken in Russia. There's no question about it. And that has always been very hard to accept in the West.
Well,
Uh,
wasn't it? Sorry, wasn't it 75% of everybody killed on the German side were killed by Russians?
Absolutely. No, even after June 1944, the Soviets
Hmm.
are killing 10 times as many Wehrmacht soldiers as the Americans and the Brits.
Hmm.
Even after Normandy, it's a completely different scale. And the United States and Britain would not have been willing to sacrifice so many men as the Soviet Union did. In many ways, didn't have a hope, didn't have a choice but to do so. So that's one thing that there's still a kind of great difficulty to accept this. The other thing that I find interesting is that, as I said, when I came to Germany in the late 70s and when I went to Oxford in the early 80s, you couldn't study the Holocaust. Oxford didn't even have a class on the Holocaust. It was a non-event. It was something that happened to the Jews. It wasn't something that you study as history. People don't know that. Since then, now many people think of the Holocaust as being the main event of World War II. This is the thing that people study. You have named chairs for Holocaust studies and so forth, including my own. When you say, actually, the Holocaust was part of of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Holocaust was part in the Nazi mind. It was a war against what they imagined to be Judeo-Bolshevism. And the mass killing of the Jews was part of that. Had Germany not invaded the Soviet Union, yes, they were already persecuting large numbers of people. They incarcerated people in ghettos in Poland and so forth. But would it have reached the kind of scale that it did uh, after the invasion of the Soviet Union is much more questionable. So these two events are closely linked together. But when you say that today, it's very hard for people to accept that the Holocaust was not a thing unto itself, that it was part of this larger campaign of changing the entire demography of Europe, of eradicating this imaginary enemy, and that Bolshevism and Judaism were tightly linked in the Nazi mind and were the main war goal of Nazi Germany.
And after, say, after Stalingrad, how did the defeat affect the German mindset?
Well, look, I mean, right after Stalingrad, Joseph Goebbels makes a speech in March in the Sportpalast in a stadium in Berlin, calling out, now it's time for total war. So it's only then, right, in March of 1943, Germany having lost something like 200,000 soldiers in Stalingrad, with 90,000 taken prisoner. And it's clear that from now on, the Red Army is moving in the other direction. It's moving west. So the regime greatly intensifies its propagandistic campaign to tell the Germans, as I was saying before, and Goebbels says that quite clearly, and it's repeated over and over, we have to win because if we lose, we know what's going to happen to us.
Hmm.
They are going to come and rape our women and destroy our cities and enslave us. Basically, he's saying they're going to do to us what we did to them. He doesn't put it that way, but
Hmm.
that's exactly how people understand it. When massive aerial bombings of German cities began and intensified in 1943, 1944, people called it Judenvergeltung. They called it Jewish revenge. Now, how did they connect American and British bombers with Jewish revenge? Because in their minds, although, even afterwards, they said, well, we didn't know what was happening. They did know. They knew something. They knew the horrors were happening there, and the associated attacks on them as revenge by those who they denied had been victimized, right? That's the
Mhm.
So the regime is working exactly on this. Now, in large part, I would say it's successful. It's successful in doing that. And the idea, the Red Army is just, systematically moving from east to west, and nothing is going to stop it. The Allies still have this notion that if they bomb open German cities, the Western Allies, then somehow the German people will rise up against the regime. But that never happens. It doesn't happen. It actually never happens. It doesn't work that way. People are not going to support you as the opponent of your regime because you are destroying their homes, and they also can't do anything. There's no way that they can rise up. It's not this. If you think about Iran now, you can sort of imagine the same kind of scenario.
Yeah.
You are not going to make people rise up by killing them. It doesn't work that way. So people are desperate. They're increasingly desperate. Again, if you look at opinion polls, one of the strange things is that after the attempted assassination on Hitler, there's a spike. It's not lasting, but there's a spike in support for Hitler. And that's really toward the end. That's summer of 44. Within a year, there is no Nazi regime anymore. So it does create a sense of despair, of rage, of fear, but it's not translated into any opposition. And in many ways, it's at least until Western armies start moving into Germany itself, even in the German populace, it still does not harm internal morale and
Mhm.
resistance to the enemy.
In the retreat, there must be fear of partisans, of civilians, of the Red Army. Does that all affect their conduct? That fear?
Yeah, yes, but interestingly, so the issue of partisans, which is, again, a sort of German military thinking, goes back to World War One, goes back to resistance in Belgium in World War One, of people shooting at them, ambushing German troops. And so already in 1941, German army orders combine various categories of people who should be destroyed right away. And that's in the Barbarossa orders. It's quite interesting. They link partisans, Communist Party officials, and Jews all together. And there's a famous diary entry by Himmler after he meets Hitler, and he writes, Jews are to be treated like partisans. So what does that exactly
Mm.
mean when you say that? So there is a notion that anyone who stands in our way, or anyone who is a political or biological enemy, should be treated as a partisan. Treated as a partisan means executed. Now, initially, there is not much partisan resistance, actual resistance by partisans. By 1942, it starts increasing. There are, among other things, hundreds of thousands of, or at least tens of thousands of Soviet troops that were encircled by the German army and are hiding out in forests, in swamps, and they start organizing, and the regime, the Soviet regime, starts connecting with these partisan units across the line, supplying them with arms, with information, with radios. And so there is a growing partisan movement. That obviously creates increasing insecurity, a sense of insecurity in the Wehrmacht, unprotected lines, trains being blown up, and so forth. The retreat, I would say, the most distinct feature of the retreat is not simply the partisan operations. They are important at times. They're important during the destruction of Army Group Center, of the
Mm.
German Army Group Center, because that is accompanied by a great deal of partisan activity, already highly organized and militarized, of destroying logistics for the German army. But what is most distinct in the retreat is something else. What is most distinct is scorched earth policy. The German army destroys everything as it retreats. It either takes it with it, like herds of cattle and sheep and industrial machines or whatever they can take with them, and what they can't, they destroy. They leave nothing behind. And there are descriptions, of what they do in Ukraine as they're retreating. In some ways, you cannot understand the the difficulties in rebuilding the Soviet Union after World War II, industrially and demographically, without seeing the extraordinary destruction by the Wehrmacht as it retreats. So I would say that's a more distinct feature of the retreat itself.
Thank you. And why did the violence persist even though the Germans were obviously going to be defeated?
Well, that's always a good question. In partly it's what I said. Look, partly it's because there's such a fear
Mm.
of what would happen. And here it's, I think, very interesting to compare the war in the West and the war in the East. So it's not only a matter of memories. It's not only the fact that, when I was speaking with my examiner at Oxford, with Michael Howard, Sir Michael Howard, and he fought in Italy. He was an armored brigade officer in Italy. He was severely wounded. And he was reading my dissertation, and he couldn't believe that what I was writing could be true, because that was not the kind of war that he had. He fought against a German panzer division, and they treated each other decently. I mean, they, of course, killed each other, but if they captured prisoners, they treated them decently, sort of with a kind of remnants of chivalry. And so, but it's not only a matter of memory. The fact is that the war in the West was completely different. It was different from the very beginning, from 1940. It was a different war. There were different rules. Western Europe was not destroyed. There were some ideas: should we destroy Paris or not as we retreat? Paris, fortunately, was not destroyed. So there was a very different type of war. So if you look at toward the end, when the Allies come in, first into Western Europe and then moving into Germany, I would say that it's a mutual understanding between the Germans and the Allies that we are not going to fight to the end. And they don't. It's only happening in the East. It's the nature of the war from the very beginning that is completely different. So these are two different wars being fought, at least on the German side, by the same army, right? It's the same
Mm.
country fighting two completely different wars. And so I would say that yes, in the West, there is a growing understanding that, okay, we put up very strong resistance. If you remember the battle in Arnhem,
Mm.
very bitter battle, the Battle of the Bulge. But these are military events, right? These are soldiers killing soldiers. But otherwise, that's conventional war. In the East, it's never conventional war, not at the beginning and not at the end. That's the huge difference, and that's why the memories of these wars diverge. I wrote about this. There was in the 1980s, there was a Soviet-American co-production on the war on the Eastern Front. It was a major series using a lot of Soviet footage, but it had different names in different countries. The same show had different names. In the Soviet Union, it was called the Great Patriotic War. Of course, that's the official
Yeah.
Soviet name. In Germany, it was called Der Unvergessene Krieg, the Unforgotten War. or unforgettable war. And in America, it was called the unknown war. So that sort of gives you an idea. These were two different wars, and they're experienced completely differently in the East and in the West.
And would you say that your work has changed the way that modern German military think of themselves?
That's a good question. I don't know about the modern German military. The modern German military has gone through all kinds of changes since these two books came out, because at the time there was still conscription to the Bundeswehr. I was living in Berlin, and there were a lot of young people there, because if you lived in Berlin at the time, this was divided Berlin inside the GDR, you were not conscripted, so it was a good reason to live there. So there were a lot of young people and old people living there. Then conscription went away, and Germany went to a different model of a professional army, and now it appears to be bringing conscription back and rebuilding its armed forces, which a lot of Germans of my generation are really worried about. You know, they fear the rise of German militarism again. I think that what has played into the sort of mentality of the Bundeswehr is the memory of the fact that the German army, and not only under Hitler, but going back to the Imperial Army, was a political player. In that sense, the German army, more like the Russian army, was part of the political paradigm. And the Bundeswehr accepted the Western sort of Anglo-American model of the army being an instrument of the government, not a player in politics, and that the army should instill in its soldiers a particular civic duty, and not only a militaristic mentality. That's not a result of my books or my colleagues, but I think of the sort of general growing understanding that the German military was in fact engaged in mass crimes. Um, Whether that's a lasting sort of legacy, I don't know. And I must say, since I've been much more engaged recently in another war, which came to be called increasingly a war, although it was no longer a war, what was happening in Gaza, and seeing how Germany was supporting it, and how close the links between the German military and military industries are with the IDF, all as based on a kind of the lessons of the legacy of the Holocaust, so completely distorted and misunderstood. I'm much less hopeful than I was in the past.
Oh, that's not good. We need hope. We definitely need
Yeah,
hope nowadays.
yeah.
What would you say the Eastern Front reveals about soldiers' capabilities of extreme violence?
Well, I mean, it reveals what we always know. I always remember this when I was, I think, 22. I was already a young reserve officer. I'd already served for 4 years. I came out of the army, and then I was called on reserve.
Mhm.
But I still had the mentality of a young soldier, you know. And I was training reservists. And they were old, as we called them then. They were in their 30s. So for us, they were called, they old, they had families, they had children. And I was teaching them all kind of techniques of doing certain things in warfare. And they were very dangerous things to do. And those soldiers sort of looked at me, this young officer, and they said, look, I mean, if you want us to do it in training, that's fine. But don't think for a moment that we would actually do it on the battlefield. This is too
Mm.
dangerous. There's no way that we would do it. Because they were in their 30s, and they already had a sense of their own vulnerability, which young
mm,
people have less of, and they had more responsibility. They already had families, they had children, they had wives. Uh, and so what do we learn? We learn that you can take young men, and armies love young men, of course, and train them, indoctrinate them into a combination of fear. Fear plays a huge role, a sense of invulnerability, of power, of destructive power. And under the right circumstances, you can train men not only to go to war and wreak destruction, but also to carry out mass crimes,
mm,
including genocide, as even as they believe that they're doing the right thing. And that's, of course, I think it's unquestionable. The bigger question is how can you prevent it? Can
mm,
you train people to do what is sometimes necessary? It may be necessary for a country, for a group to defend itself by the force of
mm.
arms. How do you do that without turning young people into murderers? That's a much more difficult task. And, I would say that human civilization has been trying to grapple with this from the very beginning. And we haven't done so well, certainly not
No.
in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Well, talking of that, in your book, you show how ideology can barbarize regular soldiers. And do you see parallels between that and, say, the ice guys in Minneapolis?
Look, I mean, um, the sort of parallel that I increasingly see that I find deeply troubling
Mm-hmm.
uh, is not with armies, because these guys, these ice guys, are not fighting anybody.
Mm,
Um, you could say whatever Wehrmacht soldiers did when they marched into the Soviet Union, they encountered an organized and brave and often ruthless opponent.
mm,
ICE is not confronting anything like that. They look like they're going to war. I mean, um, the amount of weapons that each of them carries, and I was in war. I never had such weapons.
mm,
And they use it, they are dressed to kill, and then they walk into a home and there's a grandmother there or a child. So that's not war. That's something else. And they're not soldiers. So I think what Trump and the people around him are trying to create is a militia. And those militias, yes, they of course have echoes of the past. That's a kind of political army that you're creating. They're not fighting soldiers, they're fighting civilians. That's their goal. They are there to intimidate, to enforce a policy, a politics, an ideology, and they do it brutally. Now, as individuals, I'm sure that there are people who join ICE who are perfectly decent people. In fact, I had a very nice workman come into my home to fix my air conditioner, a, a big fellow, and he told me that ICE tried to recruit him. And he said to them, "I'm Hispanic. What, are you crazy? I'm not going to join ICE." But there are Hispanics in ICE, actually. They're young men and they're paid and they're given a sense of power, and they may be unemployed or they may think the pay is better and they join. So ICE is being used, and it's been expanded enormously. I mean, it's got a bigger budget now than any other law enforcement agency in the United States. Is being used for political purposes. And that, of course, is deeply worrisome. And it
mm.
does remind one of the kind of militias that were roaming the streets in the 1930s,
Yeah.
whether in Germany or in Italy or in Hungary or in Romania. And here you have a president and people around him who are manipulating this force and if this is not controlled, this is connected to the growing assertion of power by the presidency in the US.
Hmm.
So the combination of less and less controlled executive power and the growing presence of this kind of militia on the streets, including down the street from where I live, where there were arrests in unmarked vans. I mean, this whole
Hmm.
phenomenon is truly troubling. And I hope to God that the United States will find its way out of this. The one great thing about there are a number of great things about the United States. One is that it's not a nation state, although there are people who are trying to make it into one. It's a nation of immigrants. The second thing is that the average American citizen is very suspicious of government. And that's different from most European countries. There's a different relationship toward government. And I'm still hoping that that American instinct against an all-powerful government will increase as this assertion of central executive power also increases and will push back. But I don't know.
Yeah, I hope something changes because I see a lot of parallels between this and the 1930s. A lot. Finally, Professor Bartov, what is next for you?
Oh well, for me, I have this book coming out in April.
Hmm.
Israel, What Went Wrong. I in some parts of it, I actually draw on what we talked about,
Yeah.
on mentality of German soldiers, and I go through my own biography and then of what the Israeli army has been doing. So this is coming out. It'll be out in Britain too in April. And but I'm already working on another book, which is a very different book, but it is about Israel Palestine. It's called The Broken Promise,
Hmm.
uh, a a personal political history of Israel and Palestine, and it's based on about 70 interviews that I conducted in 2022 with Jewish Israelis, with Palestinian citizens of Israel, and also with Germans who volunteered in Israel in the 1970s and 80s. So these are people of my generation, people born in the first decade or so after the State of Israel was established. And the core of the conversations is their sense of link to the place. How do they explain the connection to the place? So that's a book that I'm doing now. Hopefully, it'll be out in 2, 3 years.
Great. And I hope you'll come back and talk about your Israel book that's out in April.
Yes, happy to.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today. This is the book we've been talking about, The Eastern Front. And how was it talking about your dissertation?
Well, it's fun. Listen, I mean, what you write in your dissertation always stays with you.
Well, I certainly learned a lot from you today, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. And all I can say is take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye now.